Just sign the damn paper, Jim, Andrew told me. I've already checked it out. It's a standard IPO template. Just don't sell until I tell you to. I glared at Andrew Schwartz, our business asshole. His face looked confused and a little annoyed. It looked like this was the 10,000th document I'd signed in the last week, and all of our nerves were on edge. Harry Loeb, our lawyer, who is unfortunately that's his name, nodded at me. Both of them had been with me when we founded Ipswich Inc. a few years ago, so I signed. Finally, Gordon Jenkins pulled out a bottle of champagne and poured, and the four of us toasted to the fact that as of Monday, the company finally went public on NASDAQ as the newest IPO. Ipswich Inc. is in the business of custom router software development, and to be honest, we have some innovative work. Andrew ran the business, Gordon oversaw installation and product development, Harry was our lawyer, and I developed the code. Yeah, then it was more complicated than that. We had 100 employees, and we wanted money to hire more. A lot of companies were interested in our work, and our performance was good enough that Andrew was able to introduce our company to several underwriting banks. We weren't yet big enough to touch Goldman Sachs, although they did get a tiny slice of us through some complicated money machinations that I didn't really get into. I mean, my job was to code and make sure that my coders were organized and pulling in the same direction. That's why we had Andrew. He was handling the business side of the deal. We were just finishing our toasts when Andrew came over and put his hand on my shoulder. So what's going on with the nerd herd? Is the new version up and running yet? I sighed. Please don't let them hear it from you. Yes, we're on schedule and it will be ready soon. It was a small disagreement between the two of us. Andrew was pushing for a new product release for his sales team, and I wanted to make sure the product was of very high quality without overwhelming our current customers. I had been involved in code and IT for a long time before we started our company, and I knew that customers who aren't served become former customers. Of course, we fought often, but with Harry and Gordon acting as arbitrators, we developed a good working relationship and came to an equilibrium. He pushed me to work, and I kept his excessive ardor in check. So you're going to have a problem with this IPO and stock. Andrew was referring to my position on the board of directors. In 2000, I was graduating and working for a technology company. My new bride Allie and I were optimistic about my future prospects, and my first job included a generous equity stake in the company. Anyone who remembers that time knows how many tech companies went bankrupt. While we weren't paper millionaires who racked up a large amount of debt, our compensation left us with nothing when my first job collapsed, and it was a very cold and lonely time for a software designer. Most of my classmates were in a similar situation. Based on my experience, I made sure that we paid money to our designers, not just stock in a private company. Andrew felt that giving them stock would be cheaper and provide more incentive. Having eaten my share of ramen noodles since graduating from college, I disagreed. It came down to our board, the four of us. Gordon was with me on this one since we were the same age, but Andrew showed us the financials until Harry came up with a compromise. Everyone got a base salary, but they had the option of getting stock in lieu of bonuses and other compensation. It must have been a good arrangement because Andrew and I were deeply dissatisfied. Nevertheless, he was right. Those who bought the stock now could count on it going high enough in the next 3 months. Those who didn't could be resentful. Several of our employees tried to move their packages at the last minute. We've got to get back to the party. This final end of business was, of course, to be celebrated with a party. Andrew had insisted on it. On the one hand, we had to please our venture capitalists. On the other hand, those of us who were married had to make our wives happy. It was a very tough couple of months with analysts breathing down our necks and vetting the various insurers who wanted our business. It was fun to start the IPO. Andrew, a bachelor, ate and drank in a business-like manner that meant nothing to him. Even during the party, he watched CNBC on TV, albeit muted. "How are things with you and Allie?" he asked when we reached the top of the stairs, which overlooked his modern living room. It was typical Andrew, modern, open, with lots of windows everywhere. The entire back wall was a window to the outside. I looked at my wife, with whom I'd lived with for 11 years. She was in her element, chatting, cheering, even flirting with the various friends and business people who were invited. Her blonde hair nodded as she smiled at some witty remark said by a businessman over 60 who had invested in our company early on. His hand habitually held her elbow. She laughed, pressed her hand to his chest, pushing him away, raised her glass, showing him it was empty, and headed for the bar. It was a well-practiced gesture that put boundaries without offending. In other words, pure Allie. Well, you know, Andy, it's like most relationships, a sin wave. It goes up and down. I dashed it through the air for him. You're such a nerd. He laughed. I pretended to laugh with him. I'm not a nerd. I'm a budding entrepreneur. Don't quit your job. I looked at him. Why do you ask? You guys were all talking about your wives and stuff. I figured I'd ask, he said, studying me. I frowned. She doesn't like spending hours writing code, but I think when she sees how much money the IPO brings in, she'll get over it. If there's one thing she loves besides me, it's money. He chuckled in agreement. Allie had long wanted to be highly paid and was fulfilling her desires for a beautiful life as fast as our budget would allow. We'd had our conflicts about it, but nothing out of the ordinary, or so it seemed to me. I left him and walked over to where she was talking to a couple, taking a moment to stop at the buffet and pick up a plate of appetizers. The strange woman was an ordinary California girl in a green dress, and the man with her had a rough appearance and wavy brown hair. Time for me to show the flag. Allie chatted cheerfully with the two of them, out of the corner of her eye noticing my approach. That's funny. And this is Jim. She introduced me, raising her hand and gesturing at me. Her husband Jim, said I. She paused for a moment, signifying that my action had hurt her, but she continued as if nothing had happened. Of course you're my husband. We have the same wedding rings, silly. Silly girl was slightly emphasized. Well, of course we noticed, the woman said with a laugh. Are you wearing a wedding ring? The man asked slyly. The woman slapped his hand, pursing her lips. Be nice. He laughed. Just kidding. I'm Phil, and this is Terry, my wife, so don't you dare go after her, man. He put his arm around her waist. I held out my hand. Jim Reynolds. We shook hands. We set boundaries and started socializing. Things were going well. He had a few questions about business, which I didn't fail to answer, and then some guy who wasn't looking where he was going nudged me with his elbow, causing me to spill my plate, which I was juggling with one hand as I stood there talking. Ow! Salsa spilled all over my shirt. Oh, Gim! My wife exclaimed. She quickly dropped to her knees and began wiping up the dirt on the carpet. That's going to be a stain. Don't step on it, she said unnecessarily. I didn't budge. Now I understand why your parents didn't name you Grace, said Phil. I rolled my eyes at him and Allie grabbed my hand. Come on, we need to get this shirt fixed. I can get it, said I, wiping it off with a napkin I grabbed. It's silk, she said, continuing to drag me into the kitchen. We didn't stop there and went through the back door into a utility room around the corner that I'd never been in before. Take your shirt off, she snarled. I don't know why you're getting so worked up. It was an accident. The guy bumped into me. You could have moved out of the way. She opened the overhead cabinet, looked inside for a few moments, took out a bottle of Shout, and began to remove the stain in the utility sink. Now I'm going to spend the rest of the night in a wet shirt. God forbid we wake up early. I sighed. This had plagued my marriage from the beginning. She loved me, but always thought I was a little unintelligent. I guess it was coming from my technical education. I took regular baths and didn't look in girls' dresses. I never went to a Star Trek convention, but I had weird hobbies and even weirder friends. At least they were weird for a girl who was more inclined toward the social life than her parents' basement. Next chapter. Mistakes in the system. The very next day, the weirdness began. We had a book signing party on Friday, and I was bumming around the house. Our house was at that transition point from home to mansion. It was very well appointed, and we fought periodically over money. Allie wanted a place to live that suited our situation, and I wanted one that we could afford. Sure, I brought in over $250,000 a year in salary and company profits, but that wasn't much in California. I was uncomfortable with the cost of housing. But the house itself didn't make me uncomfortable. I have to hand it to Allie. It was very nice and cozy, not at all like the cement California houses Andrew preferred. She had decorated it very well, and even kept it within budget, although the occasional knickknacks did show up. I was sitting in my paneled room and was just chopping up a bunch of code when my email announcement beeped. I opened it and saw that it was an email from my buddy Carl. I hadn't heard from him since I'd sent him the beta parameters for our new programs, and I thought it might be some design work I'd assigned him. But it wasn't. Instead, it was this. Jim, some guy came over to my mother's house to talk to me about the Ryla beta. Of course, I was at Sheila's at the time, so I missed him. He said he wanted to discuss things with me in confidence. He knew Beta's number. I met Carl back in middle school. We hit it off because my family moved to an isolated ranch house in the middle of nowhere, and the only kid within a 10-mile radius was Carl. And I found out why. Carl had complex Tourette's syndrome. This was before Tourette's syndrome was particularly well known, certainly before there was any HBO special. And kids can be cruel. Carl was an angry boy, so his parents moved him to a farming community. For lack of anyone else, we ended up together. At first, we had our ups and downs as companions. But that first summer, something magical happened. His parents bought him a Sega Genesis. Within the first week, his mother had to flip switches to kick us out of the living room. By winter, we were both shoveling driveways, collecting cans, and doing every other chore around the house to be able to buy the next big video game. Castlevania, Mortal Kombat, and Sonic were our constant companions. Eventually, we got a few other guys involved in the game. While Carl was playing, he didn't have his tics. Carl became much less angry, but he never got over his shyness. He let me do the talking when we were working, whether it was dog sitting, mowing lawns, or other jobs. When I decided to go to college, Carl practically begged me to go to the same school with him and be his roommate. I agreed. We both enrolled as computer science majors, driven by our love of video games and the fact that we were thinking about the future. Unfortunately, most cases of Tourette's syndrome decline with age, but this was not the case with Carl. In high school, I was his roommate, confidant, and occasional tutor. I had other friends that I flirted with, which made me feel guilty, but I also wanted to have fun, and Carl was a little off when it came to finding chicks. So I divided my social life between him and the dating market. I met Allie in junior high, and we started a serious relationship in high school. She didn't socialize with Carl much, as I kept the two sides of my life separate. Except for occasional trips to the movies together, we revolved in different circles. In retrospect, I can say that my relationship with Allie distracted me from my friendship with Carl. I felt guilty about it, but that's the way it is in all relationships, especially when there's a girl involved. Allie had always been more outgoing, and we complemented each other perfectly. She was even less financially savvy than I was. I have a knack for math. I once asked her why she accepted my advances after we had already started dating, and she bluntly said that I was a package. Package? What's that? She looked at me slightly condescendingly, the way girls sometimes do when you say something they think you should already know. You know, the package. If I knew, I wouldn't ask, would I? A package is what a girl wants to see in a guy. For most girls, it's pretty much the same thing. You have to be cute. You have to be moderately handsome. Too pretty is no good because you might get played up, and not pretty is no good at all. You should be easy to be with. You shouldn't be an asshole. You have to be athletic or fit enough to be manly. You have to be a little taller, and you have to have good career potential. There's a lot more, but those are the basics. I winked at her. Isn't that a little too calculated? No more than if you were checking out my kitchen, my family, and my ass, she said frankly. That's what dating is all about. Finding the right match. Most people don't realize it, but they choose who they love. It just so happens I chose you, big guy. She hugged me and kissed me so hotly that my toes sprang up, and I wondered what else I could do to keep the conversation going. We got married, expecting everything to be great. And then the internet bubble burst. We were both looking for jobs, me in data entry and her in retail to make ends meet. Since we moved to California, we were isolated from most of our old friends. About 6 years after graduation, I ran into him again when I returned home from my father's funeral. After taking care of some business, I saw him wearing a red cape in the backyard of Pizza Hut. Honestly, I was shocked and extended my trip a day to talk to him. He was still looking for a good job, but since a lot of people were looking too, and he had a few social bloopers and no experience, he was exhausted doing chores. We had just started our business, and I was faced with a lot more code than I could effectively cut myself, so I offered him a deal. I'd send him the work, and he'd do it for free on his own time. I know what you're thinking. I'm a jerk. But my business was struggling, and I couldn't afford to pay him anything. We were a real company, though, and he could at least show his work on his resume when he was looking for a job. And not to say that his skills might not have been up to par, working for me would give him time to polish them in a real-world setting. If he did well, and we were successful, I could pay him. That way we were both getting a lot of perks. Long story short, he agreed, improved enough to get on the list, and for the last 3 years I outsourced code to him and paid him a standard salary. The only thing is, he worked from home in Ohio, not Silicon Valley. He never met any of the other employees, and I was the only person he interacted with in person. So who contacted him? The computer software industry has become increasingly friendly at times, but it's still not without its share of talent poaching and software development. The case of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates is a case in point. Someone found and researched Carl. But how did they know that Carl, living in the ass end of Ohio, was doing software development for a California IPO, and what's more, doing it well? For a while I pondered this. On the one hand, I felt good for him. He'd come a long way from pizza delivery guy to someone worth poaching. On the other hand, I didn't like the implication that anyone knew about him. As far as I knew, only our company knew he existed, and I was his only direct contact. But that didn't mean there weren't half a dozen people at our work who knew that Carl WTF at Google.com was code for them. It wasn't just me he was communicating directly with, but only me and HR had his personal information. Either someone had leaked something, or some other company had gone to great lengths to track down Carl Gretzler across the country. I sighed and put that question on hold for now. Later, I could ask some pointed questions of the HR department. I was happy for him. The fact that he was actually being groomed would give him confidence. I didn't doubt for a second that he would say yes. He liked what he had now: a girlfriend, a well-paying job, and proximity to his mom. What if he moved to another company? I pondered that question. It would be painful, but it would be good for him. Ever since he'd found Sheila, I was no longer his only friend. He needed to take care of himself, and I would be happy for him. I looked at the screen and thought for a moment, then typed, "Did you send out resumes? How did they find you? I have no idea what's going on. How do they know about Rilek? And you're sure about the beta number? The hackers communicated all the time." But there was still a big difference between discussing the version and trying to steal the code. I was sure Carl wouldn't do it, especially since he warned me. I needed to see if anyone was trying to steal the code. But that wasn't what was bothering me. Knowing where Carl lived. It gave me a little bit of an alarm. Maybe someone had just checked our school's alumni lists and matched me up with other people on our corporate board? Something to think about. The rest of the weekend passed rather uneventfully. I stayed home and turned on Lord of the Rings as background noise while I cut code. Rilek. This is how I love Lovecraft. Sue me. Andrew made me promise to be able to name our work projects instead of market names. SpoilSport was our latest version, which provided router security and fairly high-speed networking. It wasn't completely innovative. It wasn't Windows or a new operating system. But it did provide a speed boost, and it also had a side effect. Older systems were getting enough of a performance boost that you could put off buying a new computer system, which marketers thought was a gold mine. Better to spend a few tens of thousands of dollars on new software than hundreds of thousands on new systems. It was a temporary measure, but weren't most of them in business? Walking into the room, Allie looked at the TV and sighed. How many times have you watched that thing? She asked. Lost count. I like the noise in the background when I'm working. I replied, still absorbed in my computer. You should put on some new movies. Keep up to date with the latest, not just this fantasy crap. I looked up at her. It had been a constant theme lately. As I recall, when I took you to see them a few years ago, you said they were outstanding. She pouted slightly. Well, yeah. But back then, they were new, hot, and people didn't make fun of them. Now it's like a nerd obsession. I sighed. Honey, these are classic movies. They will go down in the list of great movies made in our time. I like other movies too. It's just that sometimes I prefer to watch these ones. Oh yeah, like The Hunt for Red October, Metropolis, and Wrath of Khan. See? These are all classics. These things have stood the test of time. Like those muscle cars. What's their name? The ones with the horse emblem, I muttered. She liked those kind of cars. Mustang, she declared emphatically. I wish you were cool enough to buy a Mustang, she grumbled. And why wouldn't I be? Because I have a great car. Maybe when I replace it. I hesitated. I pondered. I was getting rich enough to buy a nice car like the Stang, and that would make Allie happy. She was always cooing about the fancy toys our friends owned. The problem was that I wanted the car to comfortably fit more than just two people. For example, if we had kids one day, which seemed more and more unlikely. The next day was hectic. We had just gone to the stock exchange, and many of our people just wanted to gawk at the stock ticker. The mood in the room was mixed. Those who had received their paychecks and normal pensions were sullen or were trying in vain to be happy for their fellows who were alternately jubilant and sullen. I could only tell what stage our action was at by the sounds of groans or cheering coming from the workroom. As a rule, the cheers were interrupted by 2-to-1 groans. I tried my best not to dwell on it. We still had code to write and customers to serve. It was easy to get hung up on fast money, but fast money was made when hard money was made first. Without a product or good service, we would have become just another pets.com. I did some quick mental calculations. I just saw another $5,000 added to my net worth. Okay, I gave it a shot. I'm no saint. I was about to head back to Rylek, but then my email rang. I used the same tone for all my email announcers, so it reminded me of Saturday. I spent some time looking for mass code downloads and checked the security of the VPN we had set up for Carl and me. Nothing was showing up. Finally, I checked my email. There was still no response from Carl. I sent him another note asking him about the progress of the code module and asking him again to tell me about this person. I got home late that evening and Allie had already gone to bed, pouting. I know this because usually, no matter how late I got home, she snuggled up to me and put her arm across my chest. But not tonight. I've noticed that she's been sulking a lot lately. I felt guilty about my late nights. Work went on as usual. People were still watching the stock ticker. I grumbled good-naturedly about the blocking of financial sites. Jared, one of our programmers, only grinned. And how long do you think it would take a room full of programmers to get around your firewall? The others just laughed, and William waved his iPhone at me and stuck his tongue out defiantly. That's great, I smirked. Now all you so-called internet millionaires will have twice as much reason to work overtime like me. This elicited groans from the stockholders and evil chuckles from those who didn't have stock options. When I walked into my office, Hector, my second programming assistant, was sitting in a chair in front of my desk, studying the room. Hi. I wanted to talk to you about something. He stood up as soon as I walked in. Mindy had warned me before I walked in. Hector! I greeted him, looking at him puzzled. What's wrong? That, could you take a look at the subroutines of the 5.05 multiplex? I'm not sure these guys are up to the job, he asked a little nervously. I mulled it over. That's Reg and Ryan's section. I frowned slightly. They seem competent. What's the problem? He began to describe the problem to me. And I'd like you to check their source code for bugs. We had no problems with this module during the last run. Well, now we have a problem. Okay, I said. I'll look into it. He stood there looking at me expectantly. I just stared at him. I said I'll look into it. Is that it? He broke away from his musings. Yeah. I guess so, he said disappointedly. Okay. Why don't you see if you can figure out where it falls apart so I don't have to wade through a couple thousand lines of code? You're their supervisor. He got a blank stare. Okay, boss, he said very softly, turned and walked away. Next chapter. Bug reports. The next day was busy with a bunch of problems. Andrew asked that I do an interview about our company, and I spent the morning that way. I have to say that the pimply-faced kid asked some pretty good questions, although he seemed to know less about the business than I did. He seemed really excited to talk to me and acted, well, like a young student. Toward the end of the interview, I asked him, "What publication do you work for?" trying to figure out which trade publication had hired him after graduation. "Oh, I run a tech blog, which is pretty well received. I had 20,000 hits last year," he told me. I wanted to jump out of there, but I tried to be gracious and leave as quickly and politely as possible. After all, this young bugger hadn't made an appointment for me. I headed out for lunch, which included a couple of stiff drinks. Andrew was up to another joke or had gone too far in this business. I've interviewed seemingly everyone and now this. Nothing else. That's what he was hired for. Soothed by the drink, I got back to work and started studying that code that Reg and Ryan had failed. I spent about 2 hours checking the details, but then decided I needed to backtrack. I checked the mailbox. The module had already been signed off as working on its own 2 weeks ago. I looked for a verification email and didn't find one. That was funny because I was sure that was the case. In the afternoon, when I got home early to make a change, things got even worse. I got a letter from Carl. It said, WVZ FBLGB or FB Yinger Turjigivat onpeaks GBLBH. Furvan en naik v QVQN Jerksraguvat. LBH TBGN Saboyers. FBZR Shapsari VF NFXvat zor UBJS Nivir TBJgrejevgu Elirunek versus V JNF Nezabefgi Svafork. Org Sarge Korgan Vifgung Jr. Kubisef Pefrk YNFG Jurix. JJS? UBJ KVQ or Svakzor? It took me a while to realize what he had done, so I went looking for a translation site. The message was in the ROT13 code. Basically, you took the letter number, a equal sign 1, and added 13 to it, so A turned into N. It was a simple code, but simple enough to confuse a lot of people, at least for a while. Translated, it meant, Jim. I apologize for getting back to you so late. Sheila and I spent the weekend. You have a problem. Some asshole is asking me how far I've gotten with Rylek and if I'm almost done. He found out the details we discussed last week. WTF? How did he find me? I leaned back in my chair with a sickening feeling of dread in my stomach. 6 months ago, when I was visiting my mom, I ran into a young woman named Sheila on a flight to Columbus. She was reading a book about the neurological problems of Tourette syndrome, and I talked to her about it. Her younger brother had Tourette syndrome, and she was studying medicine. I mentioned my friend Carl, who was one of the rare cases whose symptoms did not diminish with age. She wanted to meet him as an example. It turned out she wanted to study him even more thoroughly, and 2 months ago he moved in with her. He was as happy as I had ever heard him. His work suffered a bit, but I was lenient with him. I'm no saint myself, and I understood him. The problem was that the HR department only had his old address with his mom's apartment. The only place that had his new address was in my home planner. I started to type a reply, but stopped. Carl was a smart man. He wrote in code. He thought there was a chance our message might be read by someone else. We used a VPN to transmit his code with a very high level of encryption to keep it from prying eyes. The problem was that this only protected the email from people outside the company. If it's true that these people knew about what we discussed last week, then something was rotten in Denmark. I canceled a meeting with the designers last week because of extra work on the IPO and PR. So where did all this information come from? I opened my day planner. There, large as life, was Carl's name with his address crossed out and Sheila written on it. I'd done this weeks ago and hadn't even thought to give it to HR. One of many life responsibilities that had to be put on hold due to shifting priorities. My nauseating sense of dread intensified. Had someone been in my house? I thought of all the people who had come and gone. Allie, of course. Swati, our housekeeper. All Allie's friends who came to visit us. Sometimes the laborers would come. Have we had any jobs lately? I tried to learn social. Engineering techniques all the time, and of course we had a good security system. But there were so many people coming to the house. Heck, we had a pool boy, a lawnmower, and a Terminex man. And that's just in my memory. What else was left behind or inspected? So far, I thought I could handle it on my own. The problem was expanding, and although I was good at managing staff, writing code, could balance a checkbook, and even pick a stock or two, I was not versed in political matters. And from my perspective, security and reading people is definitely politics. And in order to do politics, I needed to meet Andrew. I looked in the kitchen for Allie. She wasn't there, but waiting for me next to the microwave were several rapidly cooling cardboard boxes of Chinese food and a note saying she was here for a spinning class. Turns out there's some phenomenon in cycling where a person prepares to simulate climbing Everest, and she was doing extra workouts to try it when it came to town. That saved me the awkward conversation of asking which of her friends was peeking at my den, at least until Andy made some suggestions to me. And I really didn't want to believe it was Swati. She lived with us for 2 years and was a saint in my opinion, although Allie had her own issues. I think it had to do with female territoriality. I sighed, got in my car, and drove to Andy's place. Next chapter. 2 hours later, I was back in the kitchen. I frowned, looking at the cardboard boxes of food, now stone cold, and absent-mindedly put them in the fridge for later. Once done with that, I must have stood there for a couple minutes, my thoughts running in circles. Finally, I made a decision and walked over to the top shelf of the pantry where we kept spare bottles of booze. There was undoubtedly an open bottle of whiskey in my huge Globe bar that I just had to have, purchased at the Sky Mall store after one of my many business trips, but I wasn't in the mood for reasoning right now. I broke the seal on the new bottle and splashed some into a glass with ice. Then I lowered myself into the breakfast booth. So that's how she knew where the creek was. Reluctantly, I picked up the phone and dialed the speed dial number. "Hey, it's Jim, bastard! Tell her not to come home. She doesn't belong here." I hung up without waiting for an answer. 5 minutes later, the phone rang, ushering in a new era in my life. Next chapter. I hadn't bothered to call ahead of time. You could call it a bit of social ineptitude, which took its toll. By the time I got to Andy's house, I was trying to make sense of everything. The list of suspects was long. Like I said, it was one of those mission-style houses with lots of glass in the front and back that overlooked the valley. I got out of the car and headed for the front door. Night had fallen and there was a bright light burning inside the house. Through the side window next to. The wide, carved oak door, I saw blonde hair and a woman's cheek come around the corner. I stopped, and a smirk appeared on my face and my original intentions vanished. I wished I could rationalize my actions, but I couldn't. I wanted to look at the new conqueror Andrew was cradling. He'd had many, as he put it, beautiful tales in the past, and as far as I could tell, this woman was strutting around his apartment. So I snuck in behind her. I'm not perfect, I admit it. I'm a breathing male. I peeked and then decided whether or not to disturb him. I crept along the white gravel-strewn paths to the side wall and peered into the large glass wall. She was standing at the bar. There was movement to the left, and Andrew came into view, heading toward her. He grabbed her. I was dazed and stunned. What was this? A mistake? An affair? Please, God, let him blackmail her. And then they started doing it. She's cheating on me right in front of my eyes. At this point, a modicum of sanity returned to my head, and I pulled out my iPhone and started recording. I needed proof. For something. It hadn't yet settled in my head what I needed proof for, but the nerd in me demanded proof, even as I was overwhelmed with feelings of rage and shame. By this point, I had seen enough and wandered to my car in a daze. I don't remember how I got home. Next chapter. The next morning, Swati entered the house and looked at the empty bottle of scotch lying on the kitchen table. She had already passed my car parked in the cat corner on the road, so her gaze was thoughtful when she saw me eating a heated plate of pork lo mein for breakfast at 10 a.m. "How are you doing, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked in her sing-songy voice. "Hi, Swati," I said glumly. "Are you looking, Mr. Reynolds?" she asked, circling the house with her eyes. I wasn't usually home, and I saw her at the end of the day, not at the beginning, unless I was working from home. It was an illegal Hindu woman in her 50s or so that we hired to clean. I know. In California, we had to hire Mexicans. Allie thought it was avant-garde. No, I'm not sick. Ah. She set down her bag and lunchbox and walked through the kitchen into the living room. There, she no doubt saw the blinking message light on her phone with dozens of messages and a stack of Allie's photos stacked in the corner against the wall. "Did Mrs. Reynolds leave?" she asked innocently. "Yes," I replied sadly, and added for some reason, "Forever." She pondered this for a while. "Good," she finally said, shaking her head from side to side in her curious manner. And that pretty much told me everything I wanted to know about my marriage. Part 2. I didn't go to work that day. This was terra incognita for me. You don't go into a marriage expecting a divorce. Well, we don't do that in Ohio. Maybe it's different in California. How did you divide 10 years of stuff? How did you deal with the money? About once every half hour, the phone would ring. I checked the caller ID, each time. If it was her, I didn't answer it. If it was one of her many friends, I didn't answer. If it was that asshole, I didn't answer. If it was John Doe, I didn't answer. In short, I didn't answer. She didn't show up that day. I had two opinions about it. On the one hand, if I had seen her, I would have wanted to strangle her for inappropriate behavior. On the other hand, I would have wanted to see that she cared, that she would come home and try to make things right. I wish I could say I was direct, collected, and responsible for life, but I wasn't. Swati took out the trash and wandered around the house, minding her own business, which seemed to consist of cleaning and talking on her cell phone in Hindi, no doubt discussing the latest happenings in the lives of her employers. At least she was having a good time. And I was doing the cleaning. Last night I put away all her many photos. It was a pile of them. I used to be proud of her and her beauty, but now I couldn't bear to see her even in pictures. I thought about smashing them all and burning our big wedding book, but then I calmed down and decided that I always had lighter fluid, but I could only burn it once. While my emotions were flitting back and forth, I was looking for marriage counselors, divorce lawyers, movers, hitmen, and large quantities of liquor. Around lunchtime, Swati gave me a plate of something and some iced tea, which I needed because Hindus seem to treat chili as a vegetable rather than a spice. I appreciated the gesture and it wasn't bad. She checked in on me regularly, no doubt to make sure her boss hadn't committed suicide and to update her social media. God, how cynical I'd become. Toward the end of the day, I secluded myself in some Xbox. I was still mulling over a lot of things, and I needed to disconnect to let the various bits and pieces in my head settle. Programmers are like that. We do nothing for 2 days and then suddenly plop down and write code for 36 hours straight, driven by creative imperative and Mountain Dew, although I switched to iced tea as it was easier on my stomach. Now I was in standby mode. I was lonely and cold in my bed. It wasn't that she was missing. It was that it could be forever. I still didn't want to see her. Those images flashed through my mind. I recognized that staccato series of kisses from our own relationship. And even though she'd turned us both down in her ass, she'd never offered me a consolation prize before. Did I know who she was? Do you even know who she is? I excused myself the next morning, but told Mindy I'd be there closer to noon. The whore showed up around noon. Swati, God bless her, heard the sound of a key in the lock and rushed to open the door. "Who is it?" she asked. My wife raised her head and looked at the suddenly opened door where she was holding the key. "It's me, Swati," she replied briefly. "Oh, hello. Mr. Reynolds, Miss Allie is here to see you." My wife was just pushing Swathi and stopped, her face expressing no emotion. For the last 2 years, Swati had been calling her Mrs. Reynolds. She didn't know it yet, but Mrs. Swathi had just earned herself a very nice bonus. My wife turned around. "Swati, this is my house and you don't need to introduce me. I live here." "Whatever you say, Miss Allie. May I escort you to the visiting room?" "No, you can't." She walked down the hall, tossing her purse on the nightstand as usual. When she looked up, she saw me standing right there looking at her. She visibly flinched and took a step back. "Allie," no greeting. "I told you not to come." "This is still my house, Jim, and we have a lot to talk about." "I think we had a lot to talk about before. You seem to have a very good attitude about it." She was. She was wearing good makeup and clothes I'd never seen before. I wondered for a moment if she had gone shopping yesterday, or if Andrew had the clothes. "Yesterday was really bad, but I got through it and put on makeup," she said with a small, sad smile. We naturally moved into the living room. I sat down on the only chair as I didn't want to sit next to her. "Is this the conversation where you tell me that this is a one-time mistake? That it was just sex and that it won't happen again?" She paused, looking down at her hands. "No. This is a conversation where I'm asking for a divorce. Do you really think I'm stupid enough to risk our marriage over a simple affair?" "Well, no wonder you recovered from it so quickly. You've already picked my replacement, and it looks like you took him for a test drive or 10. Or were you always having fun behind my back?" She looked incredibly uncomfortable. "Can I?" She paused. "Swati, can you get me a glass of white wine? Would you like anything?" She asked me. "No, we have hemlock if you want some." There was no sound of recognition from the kitchen. "Swati." Again, nothing. "What's gotten into her?" she asked, getting up and heading for the kitchen. "Morals? Principles? Character?" I said back to her. She glared at me. As soon as she turned away, I reached into her purse. That night she had been going through some papers. Inside were not one, but 2 stacks of papers. One was a dissolution of marriage petition with our names on it. The other, oddly enough, was a legal document on Ipswich letterhead. I checked the first line, and then the doorbell rang. Looking out, I saw through the side windows a man in a cheap suit with a stack of papers. I grabbed the papers and rushed to the exit through the kitchen. As I passed her, Allie started grabbing my arm. "Jim, where are you going? Swati, open the door." She threw to the seated Indian man. Swati earned another bonus just by sitting and sipping tea. She knew who filled her rice bowl, or whatever they say in India. "Jim, we need to talk. You can't run away." "Swati." I shoved her off and opened my car door as Allie, giving up trying to hold me back, ran down the hallway to the front door. Flicking the garage door opener open, I started to pull away. I ducked under the windshield, risking a crash so the man I could see out of the corner of my eye couldn't get a good look at me. You see, one of the movies I liked was called Serving Sarah. It was a silly romantic comedy, memorable to me primarily because it starred Elizabeth Hurley and was one of the rare date movies during our wrestling years. In it, the server, played by Matthew Perry, had to serve Sarah with divorce papers for financial reasons. The main premise was that the time and place of serving the papers was important to both parties. Another factor was that in the 2 years I had lived in the neighborhood, a stranger had never knocked on our door. It was friends, hired help, or relatives. So the fact that just when my soon-to-be ex-wife was home, a stranger randomly knocked on the door caused me alarm. Of course, the fact that the other paper was a proxy voting card from one Allie Reynolds née Taylor to one Andrew Schwartz for her stock was another clue. The problem was that Allie didn't have any shares, but I did. Or perhaps it would be more correct to say that we had the stock, and she seemed intent on changing that. I guess I should consider myself lucky that she didn't try to blow me off, and it was ironic that she chose that particular movie. Up until that point, I hadn't connected my problems with Carl and someone sniffing out Rylek to the fact that my wife was having fun with me and my business partner. But now, there was an elegant symmetry to it all. Allie had enough access to my records to keep track of how things were going with our newest version of the software. Dozens of innocent questions over the past couple weeks suddenly didn't seem so innocent. Everything was almost ready to go. And I'm willing to bet that this is exactly what they were waiting for before pouncing on me. They were just unlucky I had time to warn them before it all came crashing down on my head. But what was I supposed to do? I noted that I had automatically made it to my work. I pulled into my parking space and noticed Hector's convertible there. Quick work. New thoughts rattled around in my head. I parked in Andrew's spot, since he seemed to like to share things without asking. I had no idea if the process server was following me or if there was another one nearby, so I hurried to the front door, slowing down just long enough to drag the key through Hector's door and punch a hole in the cloth roof just above the driver's seat. I tried to resist, but I couldn't escape the thought that Hector was in it up to his hair. I walked past security and George picked up the phone, but didn't try to stop me. When two company owners fight, it's hard to pick a side. I took advantage of this by taking the stairs to my floor. I entered the work area and the dynamics in the room changed. Suddenly, the conversations died down. The rhythm of the keyboard slowed. Mindy stood still. When she saw me, she waved a piece of paper in front of me. "What is this shit?" "Later, Mindy," I said. "Hector's in there." She shouted at my back. Inside, Hector was taking one of my diplomas off the wall and stacking it in a box. "I thought I told you I didn't ACC." I grabbed him by the back of his tie and gave him a long, steady tug as I dragged Judas out of the office where he was bent over, panting. On the way out, I grabbed one of his diplomas and pushed it so hard into the base with my foot that the cubicle wall outside my office toppled over, causing Gloria to shriek. He was busy unfastening his tie to catch his breath, and his face was flushed. I threw the diploma at him like a throwing star, and the corner hit him in the chest, and the glass in the frame shattered. Mindy stood there, holding the paper that was on her skirt in both hands, with her mouth open. "Hold my calls, honey," I said softly. She nodded dumbly. I briefly went back into my office, but saw fit to toss the box of shit out onto a kneeling Hector to the clinking of glass and electronics. I closed the lock on my door and slid the curtains closed. The muttering of voices could be heard outside. I'd been acting on autopilot so far, but I needed to start thinking, because asshole and whore must have had a game plan. They probably spent all their free time, however little it was, getting the divorce decree and running the process servers. While I was sitting there, I idly logged onto my desktop computer. An error message appeared. I tried again, typing more slowly. Again, the login failed. If I tried again, it would lock up. That piece of shit Hector, who also had admin access, had deleted my password. The stranglehold was too good for him. Of course, being the badass computer pro that I am, I had an alternate exit. Yep, a back door. And I chose an easy-to-remember password so I wouldn't forget it. And that was... I wrote off the computer, though I wasn't sure exactly what I would do with it in this situation. It had a proxy card that gave Andy stock voting rights to do whatever he wanted. The four founders owned half the shares, A large portion of the venture capitalist shares were non-voting, as were the shares issued to employees. So 2/3 of the voting shares were held by the four of us. How could she have gotten the shares? Buy them? No. Under the divorce decree, she probably should have gotten half of my shares. I couldn't stand. Up to Andy unless I could get both Harry and Gordon on my side, which wasn't easy. If I poached just one of them, I'd be leveled with Andy, and he'd probably already handed him a couple of voting shares of venture capital, as little green apples should. There was a knock at the door. Jim, it's me, Gordon. Can we talk? I worked closest to Gordon, so I went to the door. Gordon, are you alone in there? What? Look, open the door and let's talk. I considered this. Do you know what that son of a bitch and that whore did? There was a pause. Look, it's ugly. I get it. Hearts wander and stuff happens. People fall out of love all the time. But you can't let it ruin the business. I've worked too hard to let it all fall apart now. You have to be professional about this. What the hell are you talking about? Andy told me. They've fallen in love and want to get married. I'm really sorry about that. These things happen. But we don't need bad press. I hissed in anger. Are you kidding me? They're both screwing with me and trying to steal my company, and you're telling me to suck it up and take it all? It's as much my company as it is yours, he shouted. And I'll be damned if you're going to blow our chance at the big time for a woman. A few sighs sounded on the other side of the door, no doubt from several of our female programmers. I was silent for a few seconds. Jim? He said a little more calmly. Yeah, I'm here. First of all, that woman was my wife. And I'm not the one who decided to risk the company for fun. I'm the bloody victim here. If you want to blame someone, blame them. His voice became much more conciliatory. I understand. Why don't you come out and talk about it? An unfamiliar voice said, Are you his boss? Because if so, I can give it to you. Screw you, Gordon. I know. Not very original, but it hasn't been a good day so far. What the hell was I going to do? If I walked out that door, I'd get served and they'd get company. But I couldn't stay here. The guards had keys to all the doors, and I was only delaying the inevitable. Besides, how could I ever hope to work with these people again after what they'd done to me? I had a shred of pride, and seeing that snooty asshole Andrew would be too much to bear, no matter how many dividends and profits he got. The pen shook. Hey, stop it! He said not to call! Yelled Mindy to someone. The jiggling stopped. Okay. I found myself cornered. One way or another, I was going to lose my stake in the company. An idea hit me. In California, that bitch would get a big share of my assets, no matter what. But I didn't want either Andrew or Allie profiting from my endeavors. She didn't deserve any of it, and he didn't deserve the right to dispose of it. How could I change that? I picked up my iPhone and dialed the number I'd found. That's where this story began. Hello? Hi, Randy. My name is Jim Reynolds. I need you to process an order for me. Yes, sir? Came the overly young voice on the other end of the phone. I'm looking to sell about 1 million shares of Ipswich Inc. stock. My account number is 5,467 to 3,692 inches. That's a lot of stock, sir. In fact, the sound of listening to, that's it. Yes, I want to sell them. Sir, these stocks are IPOs, and they have a lot of upside potential, he loyally replied. He was really trying to give me good advice. I know. I just want to walk away. I've made my money and I'm done. Think about your commission. 2 minutes later, my iPhone beeped, confirming the confirmation. 3 minutes after that, a woman's quacking sounded from outside and the jingling of keys in my door. An ugly man in a cheap suit walked in, followed by a couple of disgruntled security guards and Mindy rubbing her butt. They were all perplexed as to why I was smiling while hugging the process server, who kept a watch on the display, and Mindy was recording it on my iPhone. Part 3. I opened my eyes Friday morning and there was a very young Indian girl standing in my bedroom with a tray. Meh, Herm. Good morning, Mr. Reynolds. Here's your breakfast. That's wonderful. Who are you? I'm Pratty. I nodded, as if that meant something to me. I looked at the tray. The only thing I recognized was coffee. Next to it were white pancakes and something reddish. Thank you, Pratty. What's this? It's breakfast. Yes, but what is breakfast? It's the morning meal, silly. She giggled. I dropped it. I wasn't about to look a gift horse in the mouth. What are you doing here? It's teacher convention day, and my grandmother is watching me. Is that okay? She said, suddenly worried. Well, you're welcome. Do we have any normal food? She giggled again. I'll talk to my grandmother. She doesn't know how to make American food. She took one of my pancakes, dipped it in the red stuffing, and popped it into her mouth. It's a sin to waste food, she stated defiantly. Well, enjoy it. No coffee for you. I spent the day talking to lawyer friends to find out the name of a good divorce attorney. Believe it or not, I didn't trust any of the 3 corporate attorneys who had worked for us, starting with Harry. That trust document had to come from somewhere. Have you ever tried to call an attorney? This is a lawsuit. After several hours of phone calls, I finally got through to my friend Judith. I explained the situation, and she sympathized with me for a few minutes, but quickly got to the point. Do you want a lamb, a pit bull, or a fox? I beg your pardon? It's very simple. A lamb tries to do things quickly, compromises a lot, and besides picking up a few billable hours, keeps everyone from freaking out. I don't usually suggest such people, but if you want to avoid a furious divorce, they might be a good fit. Next, said I resolutely. All right, the pit bull wants to fight. If you want to make the other side bleed, they're your choice. A but hung in the air. Yeah? But if you choose a pit bull, be prepared to bleed yourself. They're fighters. That's all they do. That's all they know how to do. You use them when the other side is afraid of bleeding. And the fox? I asked, drawn into the conversation. I'd never considered that lawyers could be different in personality or tactics. The fox tries to see the big picture. They don't fight when a kind word is enough. A pit bull will fight to win, even if it can't win a fight. A fox, on the other hand, tries different options, including fighting. So I want one of those, right? You'd think so. The problem is that foxes are rare, and frankly, sometimes foxes outsmart themselves. And they're not as conciliatory as a lamb or as aggressive as a pit bull. I pondered all the angles I would likely face in my upcoming divorce. I don't think I have a choice. I want a fox. It's likely to be messy. There's another thing about foxes. They are whores of the legal profession, she continued. Excuse me? Repeated I. Beautiful blondes with huge brown hair. Very popular. So they get to pick their clients. I'll give you a couple names, but it's up to you to get them to take you on as a client. I'll take my chances. As it happened, Roland Thurman Esquire gladly took my case. It seems one of the clients had a heart attack and died, so he had an opening. Law is a funny business. We met and had a very long conversation. He gave me a lot of homework to do. I got home a little after 4 o'clock. Swati was standing at the door and Pratty was standing next to her with an awkward look. The woman frowned. Mr. Reynolds, Ms. Alley came with a man and stole things. Stole things? What kind of things? Clothes, jewelry, your laptop? In a panic, I rushed into the room. My laptop was still lying in its case on the table. It's still here, Swati. No. The one that P-Yank. Oh, that's hers. She's a cheater. She shouldn't keep her dowry. I sighed. If this is the worst thing that's happened, you should change the locks, she said firmly. Then, oh, call a locksmith. I'll leave it to you. She stood looking at me. What? I need money. Oh, I felt stupid. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a couple $100 bills and held them out to her. Allie usually handled that part of the bills. She patted my shoulder gently. You don't worry, Mr. Reynolds. I'll fix it. There were smells and sounds coming from the kitchen. From the radio came a woman singing in a foreign language. I poked my head into the kitchen and was stared at by another Indian woman standing over a pile of pots and pans from which many odors were coming from. Hi, Mr. Reynolds. Hi. My life seemed to be making less and less sense as time passed. Swati was standing behind me again. Mr. Reynolds, the phone has been ringing all day. Did you answer it? No, Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Andrew was unresponsive. Her tone spoke volumes about how unpleasant she found him. Big deal? A boot scrape? I agreed with her. I retreated to the den to check my messages. I hadn't been there a minute when Pratty appeared with iced tea on a tray. Here you go, Mr. Reynolds. Thank you, Pratty. I'd prefer something stronger. Would you like a stronger tea, Mr. Reynolds? The idea of getting drunk in the presence of a child seemed very bad, so I abandoned the idea. Never mind. Who was that in the kitchen? That's the cook you wanted, Mr. Reynolds. A cook? What do you mean, cook? You wanted American food, so Grandma hired Tripty. I never said hire, I blurted out. The kitchen smelled really good. We'll discuss it later. I checked the machine. Andrew's voice came out. You son of a bitch! What have you done? The insurers are calling and they're not happy, you bastard! I told you not to sell until I got authorization. Call me right now. We have to settle this with them. Beep. That's the second message, bastard. I know I entertained her, but that's no reason to act like this. You need to call me immediately. They're getting upset and want to know why the hell you broke the lockdown. You signed the papers and then you do this? We have to fix this by the end of the trading day, Eastern Time. What the hell am I supposed to tell them? Beep. How about you tell them you entertained my wife, asshole? I heard a giggle as Pratty stood there. I'm sorry, Pratty. Please don't tell your grandmother. It's Prathi, and I've heard it all in school. Here is your tea. She offered another glass. I continued listening, sipping my tea leisurely. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon East Coast time. Why don't you have your cell phone on? Because I don't want to talk to you, asshole. I decided to watch my language too. They're talking about legal aid. Is this some kind of stupid sick revenge thing? Apparently, Andrew was having a miserable day, and I felt much better, though I didn't realize what the blocking was. There were dozens more messages, and I didn't feel at all like listening to the rest of them right now. I was about to get on the computer and look up some information when there was a shout from the front door. Mr. Reynolds, there's someone to see you, Swati said in a strange tone. I walked to the front door, and there stood Mindy with a menacing expression on her face. Hey, Mind. How are you doing? First of all, you can tell your asshole that I'm not that slut. And they fired me. Swati clucked her tongue disapprovingly. Jester? I poked my head out of the front door, and there stood a Hindu man in a turban and mustache. He raised his hand to his forehead in greeting. Mrs. Swati? Asked I. This is Mr. Singh. He has offered to look after the house until my cousin can fix the locks, she explained, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. When can your cousin fix the locks? I asked. When he gets out of prison. Naturally. I turned to Mindy as a more explainable situation. Let's talk in the room. Is Miss staying for dinner? Asked Swati very simply. I threw a glance at Mindy. She shrugged and nodded. Yes. Hindy's loud voice was sent into the kitchen, and an equally loud reply came back. At that moment, I held Mindy by the elbow, guiding her into my den. Would you like a drink, ma'am? Pratty asked. Asked Pratty. Mindy shook her head negatively and looked at me. Exactly how many people work for you? One, I think. She looked at me reproachfully. Are you sure? I started to hesitate, so I changed the subject. So, What happened after security escorted me out of the building? I asked. She chuckled. I can't believe you did that to Hector. Anyway, Mr. Schwartz yelled at me for a while. Then he officially announced that Hector was taking over the section because you were having personal problems. When asked, he hinted that the stress of the job was making you unbalanced. She rolled her eyes. I don't know where he could have gotten that idea from. So what's going on? Well, I caught Allie and Andrew getting. I stopped and looked around for the girl who was tricking me. It looked like she was going to ambush me with a divorce right after we finished the new project and transfer my voting rights to Andrew. That's what this office mess was all about. The guy was catering to me, and Hector seemed to know it was coming. That bastard. Her eyes flashed, and she flung her brown hair back from her face. A distant cluck came from somewhere in the house. Which one? She tilted her head. I guess I'm spoiled for choice. Did she really do that to you? Poor thing. She sympathized. So what are you going to do? I couldn't keep from giggling. I don't think it's going to work out the way they planned, but I guess I'm getting a divorce. A grimace appeared on my face. It's been a rough couple days. She took my hand and looked at me seriously. It was a disgusting thing to do, and you didn't deserve it. I'm sorry I came here to yell at you. My problems aren't that big. Maybe you can at least give me a good reference. Sure. After hesitating, I asked the next question. How did the staff take it? It was her turn to pause. No one knows what's going on. The good mood of going out in public is gone. All they know is that you attacked Hector and that Andrew is acting like you're gone. There was a hell of a lot of shouting today, and all the big bosses, Mr. Jenkins, Loeb, and Schwartz, have been conferring all day. Greta, Schwartz's secretary, told me about it. You're not very popular with them for some reason. Accept it, my heart, I replied dryly. Continuing, she said, no one is happy. But they have to work, you know? It's a very bad economy. It's been a pleasure to be in a place where things are going well. Hopefully they're doing well now. What's going to happen next? What do you mean? I mean with you. With the company. She looked at me intently. Well, I've already been served with divorce papers, and I won't be working with Andrew anymore. Since I don't see him resigning, I guess that means I'm out of there. As for the company, that's no longer my problem. Are you going to be okay? Sighing, I nodded. You know what? It's a divorce. It happens a lot. I'm not sick. I'm still the programmer I used to be, so I can find something I like to do, and I've made a lot of money for the company so far. It hurts, and I hate both of them, but life goes on. I'd love to get drunk, but Pradi's running around, so... It dawned on me that perhaps that was why Swati had brought her granddaughter here, to keep me from self-destruction. She was very beautiful, but I don't think your wife is nice, and I think she is stupid. Andrew isn't respectful or responsible, and he already knows what kind of woman she is. Mr. Reynolds, Diener. By mutual agreement, we put aside my marital woes, and I actually enjoyed the meal. It was shrimp and curry, and I had never tasted anything like it. She gave me a tour of the house and muttered admiring comments. The stack of photos elicited rusty laughter, and we agreed to keep in touch. Next chapter. Since I no longer had to write code for the bastards, I adjusted my schedule. And that meant I woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning when the front door opened and a strange Indian man in overalls walked in. He waved his hand at me. Hello, Mr. Reynolds. He then began to take apart my locks. I walked to the windows, checking to see if there were any U.S. Marshals or police officers outside. Did they let you out of jail? I asked him. He looked at me strangely. Yes, Mr. Reynolds. Good. I hope the bail wasn't too high. He looked very hurt and muttered something in Hindu towards the door. He left, leaving me with new keys and refusing to take any money. The weekend passed in phone conversations. I started by calling my mother. This resulted in a long and drawn-out conversation. She offered to come to California, but I said my house was already full of people, which required a separate explanation. She got emotional and had quite a few harsh words for Allie, whom she initially liked a lot. You have to hand it to Allie, she made a good first impression on people. Too bad she had the morals of a snake. In a way, I should have seen that coming. She had a very pragmatic approach to our relationship, and that should have been alarming. But I honestly thought we had some underlying attraction and affection. It seems I was only half right. Next, I sent Carl a long letter telling him exactly what had happened. I told him that just because I didn't work there was no reason for our mutual dismissal. I reminded him that he has a girlfriend now, and he should be thinking about both of their needs. For that matter, he should talk to Sheila about it before making any rash decisions. And actually, I joked, he could take Hector's place. Swati showed up in the morning. Swati, don't you rest on weekends? I was sure she wasn't around when it was just Allie and me. You need me for cleaning, Mr. Reynolds. Did Pradeep fix the locks? Yes, he did. Thank you. I didn't bother to mention that I didn't feel good about having a criminal fix my locks. What's he doing now? He's back in jail. Ah, is he on a work release program? Not exempt. He's working there. It's a good job. He's a locksmith. You know, perhaps Allie was right about my social skills. Luckily, Swati had Prati with her again, and I was able to apologize for my idiocy last night, with her acting as translator. She thought it was hilarious. They stayed the whole weekend, including Triptai, my new cook. My plans to play Xbox and drink whiskey didn't materialize. There was one unpleasant task remaining. You see, Allie and I had a very advanced social schedule, more due to her than me. We had planned to visit an art gallery with another couple. It was actually Phil and Terry from last weekend's party. How much life had changed in a week. I caught Terry on the phone and told her quite bluntly that Allie and I were getting divorced, that I had caught her cheating on me with the previous owner, and unfortunately would not be able to attend the opening. Yes, I was ashamed as hell, but I wasn't going to sugarcoat the situation and be the villain in the story. Since we had just met, she felt awkward asking questions of a virtual stranger, but made sympathetic noises and hurriedly said goodbye. Monday came, and even though I felt double-holed at the sight of my job and my marriage, it was still nice to wake up late and not be responsible to anyone. My good mood lasted until 10 o'clock, when there was another knock on the door. The same bailiff in a different cheap suit stood there. You've received a subpoena, he said, showing me the envelope, his eyes nervously darting around, probably looking for the next loony secretary or photographer. Listen, asshole, I already got the divorce decree, or don't you remember? How could I forget? Why don't you read the papers and wish me a nice day? He said softly, and muttering, walked away. I suppose this process would help me get a thick skin. I started reading the papers. It seems that our main underwriter bank was suing me for violating the lockup agreement. I had just finished reading when the doorbell rang again. Next chapter. Are you Mr. James Reynolds? A young blonde woman with acne scars asked me, looking at us in awe. We moved the picnic table to my backyard, and Mindy, Roland, and I settled behind it, spreading out the piles of papers in front of us. Yes, yes. Please hand the summons to Miss Johnson there. Let me sign for it. Who is this subpoena from? It's from Troy Anderson. He's seeking damages for the lockdown, Mindy said in a bored tone. Do you get served often? The woman asked. You have no idea, I said honestly. In fact, I had been continuously served with subpoenas since the morning before. After the third bailiff arrived, I called Mindy and Mr. Thurman to help me and work on my divorce. We moved the whole operation outside. It was a very pleasant California day. Why not enjoy it? The woman walked away, muttering to herself. I seem to have that effect on people. I have to admire a man who endures such a train wreck like you, Mr. Reynolds. And thank you for getting me out of the office today, my lawyer said. Don't mention it. Every time I say, it can't get any worse, it does. So I'll just smile and let it all go. How many subpoenas now, Mindy? Taking her notebook in hand, She bit her lower lip, mentally calculating. 8 from the insurers, 3 from Ipswich. 1 for property damage, 1 for hostile work environment, and another for acting in a manner detrimental to the company in violation of the board's duties. Hector's civil suit, and 1 from the bitch to freeze the transfer of the community property. A little late if you ask me. 13 in all. Next chapter. When a company goes public, it goes to a bank to sell shares. They can do this more efficiently than we can. They don't tell us how to fix computer routers, and we don't tell them how to sell stock. When a company first goes public, it doesn't want to flood the market with stock. The bank and the company make money by selling stock, and they want to control the amount of stock on the market. Our net worth, at least on paper, was about $50 million. If we offered 50 million shares, it would be at best $1 a share. So only a small portion of the company was offered for sale to test the market and set a higher price. Since the owners usually owned a majority of the stock, they had to sign a lockup agreement. Essentially, it stated that I was not allowed to sell any shares for at least 3 months. We had about 8 million shares in our company, and we initially sold only 1 million. By my actions, I unwittingly doubled the number of shares on the market, cutting the price at least in half. I would like to be clear on this point. I did not know what I was doing. I had been signing the paperwork for days. I purposely gave all the business details to Harry and Andrew and relied on their advice, which I foolishly thought was in my best interest. But that doesn't make my act any less wrong. My only intention was to leave the company with my dignity and assets intact, while depriving my wife of her stake in the company I had built and preventing Andrew from gaining control and defrauding everyone else. It didn't matter that Gordon had suddenly turned into a conniving weasel. He shouldn't capitalize on his betrayal. And I had no other intentions. And I certainly didn't anticipate how events would unfold. Part 3. The mass of subpoenas was due to a lot of people being angry with me. Most underwriters spread the risk among themselves. So, we had one main underwriter and 7 others who also sold shares, including, I'm proud to say, Goldman Sachs. I have to admit that I felt a certain pride in being sued by an institution of this level of prestige. I felt that I was in the wrong. However, there is one truth about legal cases. They move with glacial slowness, especially at the corporate level. Much more personal matters used to intervene. His Honor sat at his desk while a decorative stenographer took notes. Bryson Coopersmith represented the hooker present, and he was in rare form. His actions were deceptive and detrimental to my client's well-being. He purposely sold his appreciating assets to deprive my client of her rightful share of the common property. I gave a dozen examples of how a successful technology IPO should be priced in the first 3 months. I wasn't listening to him, considering Roland Thurman, ESQ. He sat in front of the judge, his gray hair surrounding his head in a vague halo. His glasses rested on the top of his head, his chin rested on his chest, and his hands were folded on his tweed-covered belly. I kept wanting to kick him, but I suppressed the urge. I had enough to worry about with the assault charges. With the way the last month had been, that wouldn't be surprising. And then, to top it all off, he gave me back the signed divorce certificate along with all the shares, he finished. It was true, and it almost made me want to decline Mr. Thurman's services as my attorney. We reread the divorce decree 3 times, and on Wednesday, after she handed me the statement, Thurman had me not only sign the decree, but also buy 500,000 shares of Ipswich Inc. stock to give to my dear wife. Fortunately, Prouty wasn't at home because I tied her up immediately after hitting the button to buy and transfer the shares. The judge looked at Mr. Coopersmith incredulously. "Aren't these the papers your client handed to Mr. Reynolds?" "Exactly, Your Honor," Thurman hissed from his chair. "Sir, they were filed under the current terms of the company's business, not after Mr. Reynolds crippled the company with his illegal actions." "Not illegal. This is a civil case. And as Mr. Coopersmith knows, investing in IPOs, especially in technology companies, is highly speculative. When I sold the stock, I hit In fact, made the top of the market. Our initial price was $6 a share, and by the time we sold, we had gotten $1 a share. Thus, I made $7 million. My lawyer, damn him, convinced me that I should buy back 500,000 shares of Ipswich Inc. to satisfy the divorce decree. But by then, the stock had fallen to $2.50 apiece. So instead of the $3.5 million she expected to receive, she received $1.25 million in stock value, plus another $500,000 in real estate, furniture, and bills. She stated the number of shares in total ownership, not the specific value. In my opinion, she got much more than she deserved. But suddenly she had to prove that giving her exactly what she wanted was now a bad thing. It was a very bittersweet moment. Saving $1 million, but giving Hooker the stock she so desperately wanted. Of course, this decision completely reversed my position on keeping Andrew from taking over the company, which I was adamantly against. Thurman had talked to me at length about it before the meeting. Listen, Jim, you're already gone. What do you care who's in charge? It'll let you keep your money, and if what you say about Mr. Schwartz is true, they'll regret this day themselves. There was an uncertainty in my gut about this, but I reluctantly decided to sign the document. A large stack of papers fell onto the judge's desk. What's this? He asked. If I'm not mistaken, Thurman said without opening his eyes, this is Mr. Reynolds' theatrically offered rebuttal of manipulation and deception. You will find records that Mrs. Reynolds, the day after her husband learned of her infidelity, used $50,000 worth of credit cards to buy clothes, jewelry, and cash. So, my question for Mr. Coopersmith is, does he resent a spouse making arbitrary and fiscally harmful last-minute decisions about the other spouse on principle, or only when my client does? Your Honor, protested Bryson. He's right, Counselor. You're asking for a reversal of your own agreement. More argument ensued, but nothing more was resolved. Counselors. Leaving with Mr. Thurman, I asked, do you think we can get away with this? Hell no. This is California. If you want justice, next time get divorced in Ohio. But now all the responsibility falls on them, and they'll probably get less than half of what they're asking for. Judges are human, sometimes. They sometimes encourage neat tricks and deserved punishment if it's legally justified. He glanced at his watch and picked up his briefcase. I need to get some statements, so I'll talk to you later. This was really bad. I wanted to discuss some other things Allie hadn't specified in her divorce decree. I was contemplating whether to bring home some KFC when a cloud of her perfume announced her presence. Hi, Allie. I didn't need to mention that both of our lawyers would have chewed up kittens if they caught us having a normal conversation. But what was the chance of me having a normal conversation? Jimmy, what do you want? My patience was at an end, but I had to admit to a certain curiosity. Some part of me hoped she would regret her decision, that she thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Admitting that would be soothing to my soul. I even wanted her to want to reconcile. Don't get me wrong, I wanted this to dash her hopes. Mostly. I guess. Longing memories of days gone by and my blue balls conspired to make me consider irrational options. And don't call me that. Okay? She smirked. Mr. Reynolds, I haven't talked to you in forever. With a snort of laughter, my tension went down 2 notches, which was undoubtedly her intention. She was still savvy and knew me well enough. She must have been, if she was able to trick my eyes so cleverly. I had to. Watch her, but I wanted answers to my questions. I pulled my iPhone out of my pocket and entered the code, checking my calendar. I don't have to go back to work until 4, ever. Do you want to get coffee? She nodded warily, but with some anticipation, or so it seemed to me. We went to one of the cafes in the courtyard and found a table in a secluded spot. She was wearing a beautiful silk blouse that I hadn't seen before. She looked chaste. Hiding her round heels was probably a smart legal strategy. Nice blouse. I tried to start casually, but she noticed the way my jaw clenched at those words. She sighed. This whole thing sucks. I know what you're thinking, and you're partly right. You did take us by surprise. We didn't know what you were going to do, whether you were going to file a restraining order or have a bailiff come over the next day, so we had to make it up on our own. That meant, she grumbled, that I made sure I had enough stuff to get by for a while. There was a sale at Walmart, I said dryly. You didn't have to go to Saks, but I understand your feelings now. Understand? Yes. Andrew has a bad habit of not paying for his woman, so he's still single. Her breath hissed inwardly. That was inappropriate. We're discussing marriage. Well, I'm relieved that you're not going to give up a beautiful marriage for meaningless entertainment. So what was your game plan? Looking into the foam of her mocha, sick, Allie gathered her thoughts. It wasn't supposed to be like this. You were supposed to finish off Rylek. The company was supposed to go uphill. We would have fought some more. I would have filed for divorce, and after you'd get a chance to get over the hurt. I'd open up to Andrew, and we could move on without destroying your business relationship and the company. I didn't want to hurt you any more than I had to. Andrew didn't want to either. Yes, of course he did. He's a prince. And when did you two start having fun? It evolved. Look, does it matter? I don't want to get into it. Andy's a person just like me. We're compatible in a way that you and I weren't. It matters to me, because it sounds like your plan was to keep him entertained until all of this happened. And I agree. You're both cheaters. Looks like the stress of the IPO was a good excuse for divorce. You didn't put together a proxy card for months in advance. I remember being a package. So, what happened to us? Nothing happened, she replied bitterly. That's the problem. Nothing. Nothing happened. You're still the same guy I married back in the dorm. You've got your little Xbox and your stupid movies, and it takes an act of God to get you out of our house for a social event to act like a normal adult. A normal adult? You mean we're getting divorced because of my choice of entertainment? Because I don't want to go to wine tastings or boring plays? You're dumping me because I don't like Brie. My fists clenched with anger. You're trying to make me look like the bad guy. I'm not. I wanted to find a soulmate. Someone who loved and respected what I wanted. We were supposed to grow up together. But you haven't changed. I grew up and wanted more. So, starting an IPO before you're 37 is nothing? It's not nothing. I'm proud of what we've done, she said in a soothing tone. I'm not saying you're a bad guy. You're a great guy. You're just not a good fit for me. We? I'm sorry? Said I incredulously. We are. I've been making sacrifices. Those hours when you were gone. Those unsustainable loans we took out. Earning clothes and trying to feed us on our measly paychecks. Enduring the cold and lonely nights. I got calls from girlfriends married to portfolio managers and lawyers and couldn't go out with them because I couldn't pay my portion of the lunch check. I had to flirt with all these venture capitalists. Enough, she said firmly. She saw the look on my face. I was flirting. I'm not a whore, but I was networking to make sure this company went public. So you say. What do you call a woman who entertains her business partner for his share of the business? I've earned my share of that money, she replied hotly. I tried to contain my fervor. So, you equate talking to people with doing something. You've lived with me. I spent days and days cutting code. You know how much I worked 18 hours a day, and I know it took a toll on our marriage. But I did it. Not you in a low-cut dress. Without me, you're only selling yourself. And certainly not Andrew. You can sell a crappy product for a long time and it won't get any better. If it wasn't for my code, he'd be selling cars in Fresno or something. Some people sleep alone in bed for decades, and it doesn't do what I did. If I hadn't supported you, you wouldn't have been able to do what you did. I supported you, took care of you, and nursed you when you were sick. I was a good wife to you. Yes, a good wife. And yet, as soon as you could comfortably escape, you pushed the ejection handle. I put my hands up to prevent her comments. I can see, as painful as it is, that you wanted out of the marriage. Sometimes things don't work out, but there are certain protocols that you had to follow. We fight, we sue, the lawyers make a settlement. Maybe you get a piece of the company and a bigger payout, or maybe we just split everything in half. But you should have divorced me because you were unhappy, not because you decided to fall in love with someone else, and certainly not before you started having fun with someone else. Marriage means you stop buying the kit, not that you seek to change it at the first opportunity. I don't consider you a whore. I consider you a thief. I was hoping you'd come to your senses and get your lawyer to offer me something fair, followed her flat reply. I'm doing as fair as you are. Tell me, has it never occurred to you that perhaps Andrew is just using you to gain control of the company? She smiled indulgently at me. I'm not an idiot. It has crossed my mind, but it's unlikely and irrelevant. She ran her hands over her figure. I'm a package. I'm easy to get along with, and I'm very pretty. I can choose who I want to be with. And if Andrew turns out to be stupid enough to leave me, I'll be all right. For one thing, I'll still have my shares. The proxy card can be canceled, and it won't be hard to find someone else. Yeah, or a similar word beginning with S. Her face turned stormy. I slid off the chair. I'll take your suggestions under advisement, I said diplomatically. Jim, she looked at me pleadingly. This doesn't have to get ugly. Let's just act mature. You mean flip over to get exactly what you want? Sure. I needed to get away from her. I knew she was a pragmatist, but what was that saying? Pragmatism is the first step on the road to sociopathy? That seemed to fit. I walked out of the courthouse and pulled out my iPhone. Nice blouse, said the person I was talking to. Allie was right about one thing. It was time for me to start growing up. Next chapter. It was a slow cycle of business news, both bad and good. It meant that the legal issues of our IPO got a lot of press on Bloomberg and CNBC. Andrew must have been sweating over it. But I noticed that the press comments suddenly started characterizing me as a tech sector scammer. The talking heads on Squawk Box speculated that I hadn't written the code, that I had willfully waited for a good stock price rise and then illegally sold my shares, laughing all the way to the ground, leaving hapless employees to fend for themselves. Since I was not a business person, I didn't pay much attention to it. My mother, bless her heart, finally asked me how I could let the press get around me like that. If I don't look out for my interests, who will? I mean, besides Swati and Co. And yet, after talking to Allie, I realized that Andrew is not going to give up either. And he's going to fight with words and sales. Now, remembering my backdoor code, I could eventually sneak in and completely destroy Rylek. But all fingers would be pointed at me, and rightly so. Besides, I didn't want to destroy the company. I just wanted Andrew and Allie to feel the pain. The first thing I did was contact Allie's lawyer to get a phone number. The second was to flip through my calendar. I had done a lot of business interviews in the weeks before the IPO. Maybe it was time to talk to them again. Next chapter. An ugly man sat down nervously across from me. Yes, it was the same bailiff. He was bald, with a puffed-out lower lip and heavy facial features, and I had met him often. Would you like some tea? I asked. I'm fine. I'm sorry about the other day. Made you chase me around. I just needed to do a couple things before I let you serve me. It's okay. It was one of my most interesting days. Besides, I get paid for mileage. I laughed and started using Google Map. What are you doing? He asked, licking his lips. Maximizing my profits, I replied, holding out an envelope to him. Next chapter. Mr. Reynolds, it's Ms. Allie on the phone. I wonder what that was all about, I smirked. I had a couple guesses. You asshole. You are an absolutely indescribable asshole. Hey, Allie, how are you doing? Still having fun with Andrew? A cluck was heard from the hallway. How could you do this to me? I've been your wife for almost 11 years. I could ask you the same thing, babe. Did you relay our conversation to them? And those pictures? That was a private conversation between the two of us. Car salesman offering to show me the good life. Photographers follow me everywhere. My mother. Oh my God, my mother. You paint me as a whore digging for gold. Please, please, I said modestly. You didn't need my help. But while we're on the subject, who's spreading all this slander about me on the news? My answer was silence. Since you two used your social skills to slander me as a certain Bernie Madoff, I decided to use bitch power to make sure my side of the story got at least a little coverage. I had no idea this would become nationally publicized. You should be complimented on what a package you are. Consider me helping you expand your choices. Remember how long Deborah LaFave was in the news? An incoherent scream was my only response, and suddenly the line cut off. She seemed to take offense to the fact that I had sent her little conversation to some reporters slandering me. I had always been proud of her beauty. Now I could share my pride. All in all, it was a good day. But let's move on to Andrew. Allie had kicked me out of the relationship, and she'd get a piece of my business no matter what, but I had to wonder how much that vile bastard had worked to seduce her. From what she said, she was still looking for a life partner and didn't let me know. His call came a day or so later. Why the hell did you ask me for service at my gym? His voice was wary and suspicious. Good. I didn't need to tell him I'd picked this place because it was the farthest a bailiff could get to. His kids had piano lessons. Andrew, that sneaky weasel, would assume it was for some strategic reason or to embarrass him. Let him guess. Oh, good. He's found you. How does it feel to sit in ambush? Is that what this is about? Cheap revenge? I consider it a very expensive revenge, thank you very much. What do you mean Ipswich version 5.0 and all derivative software development? You can't do that. It would cripple the company. Now, I'm not forbidding you from using enemy software. But since I'm no longer part of the company, I feel my efforts should be rewarded. Cliff, the ugly litigator, caught Andrew in his gym with a letter of intent. You see, I solely developed our original software packages, with a little help from Carl, and I owned it. It was licensed from Ipswich. I did this because I wasn't sure if Ipswich would be able to pull ahead, and I wanted to be able to pass it on to another software company if it failed. After all, I had a family to support. The irony was killing me. Since I was a founder with a huge amount of stock, our company's profits went into my pockets, so I waived or reinvested any royalties. But I never signed any documents waiving my copyright rights. And there was a clever, red expensive, legal argument that all the subsidiary versions of the software I worked on also belonged to me. As in the movie. I own the Harry Potter character, even if another writer or studio used his image. Look, we have to come to some kind of agreement. What do you want? Well, I'd like my wife and company back, but they've both been tainted by a low-down piece of shit, traitorous asshole. So that's out of the question. How's the stock price? You bastard. See you in court. Allie must be doing this for the money from what I've seen. Saw? His voice became even more wary. Enough of that. The past. If you and the venture capitalists drop all the lawsuits, I think we can come to a reasonable financial agreement. And how am I supposed to do that? How do you get my wife to go to bed? You'll figure something out. I can't control the insurers. I didn't mention the insurers, I pointed out reasonably. I'll have to deal with them myself. It was time to twist the knife. One more thing. You need to talk your asshole into not contesting the divorce agreement. I don't want to interfere with your marital. My mocking laughter cut him off halfway through. I noticed he didn't step up to defend Allie's honor. You got yourself involved, and if there were lawsuits for alienation of affection in California, you'd be looking down the barrel of one of them by now, and with a videotape of it. She won't go for that. That's not my problem. If you don't go along with it, We'll be talking about a fair use injunction. After my divorce is settled, she won't see a dime of it. It wasn't mentioned in her divorce agreement. Allie found herself in a quandary. She demanded that assets be frozen in her settlement agreement. Each of us could only access small amounts of money. I was getting more because I was keeping house and she was not. Since she was maxing out her credit cards, she needed the money. And if it drove a wedge into their festival or their cute couple, well, I felt just awful about it. As for me, I was having a blast on eBay selling off things I didn't like and was shocked at some of the prices I was getting. I'm sure I'll find out legitimately later, but at the moment I didn't care and she didn't know. Why are you acting like this? If you ruin the company, you'll hurt a lot of people, not just the two of us. Funny how you never thought of that when you were plotting all this. Don't play the sympathy card, Andy. You can't play it. I'm not interested in discussing this. You have my letter. Think about it carefully. Next chapter. Operator error. I've had my share of fun so far. Yes, they stabbed me in the back, but I stabbed them hard financially and emotionally. If Andrew wanted to save his company, he should have gotten Allie to agree to her financial deception. If she wanted the stock she screwed over to be valuable, she needed to make sure the company was really worth something. But she had just been publicly reviled, and she wanted to get paid. I didn't see Andrew being particularly sympathetic to her distress. From what I understood, there were a couple reporters there all the time taking pictures of them. To avoid angering her, I mentioned in the letter that I was being approached for the movie rights. No, that wasn't true, but why should I care? You can imagine her reaction. My perspective began to change when an unexpected guest came to visit me. I had just returned from my morning run and was sipping freshly squeezed watermelon juice. Tripti was preparing idali for breakfast, and Swati was enjoying the first of many tea breaks. The doorbell rang and we all looked at each other. Was it another bailiff? Swati, frowning, stood up and followed him. Mr. Reynolds, this is Mr. Loeb. Harry Loeb, my former business partner, walked into my kitchen. He was dressed in a polo shirt and slacks rather than his usual business ensemble. Hello, Harry. To what do I owe this honor? He looked a little depressed. To Jim. Shouldn't you be at work, writing power of attorney documents, shuffling our corporate structure or something? He grumbled. We missed you at the last couple board meetings. I laughed. Fat chance. I paused, curious. What do you mean? I mean that you never got voted off the board. I can't believe that wasn't your first order of business after I was served. I came here to hear your side of the story. When Schwartz told me you sold us out, I was very angry with you. You broke the lockout and put the whole company at legal risk. I was the one who prepared those motions and planned to skin you. He fell silent. I can hear the buts. But then I saw the news with Allie, and it raised a few questions. Andrew told us that the two of them were drawn to each other and that you were gushing over their friendship. And you believed that? I found it hard to believe, but I also found it hard to believe that you would strangle Hector and throw him out of your office. Anyone can break. I mulled it over. You're right. It's been a tense couple of days. Why don't you tell me about them? I told him my story. I told him about people knowing things they shouldn't know, about people approaching Carl to finish off Rylek, about catching Allie and Andy together. I offered to show him the video, but he refused. I showed him the proxy voting card, and he silently read it. Looks like this is Jenkins's work. I always thought he was a weasel. I didn't sign up for this and didn't know it. When I saw those broadcasts with Allie and the excerpts from the tapes, I asked Andy some questions, but there was no need because Allie answered his home phone. So, what are you going to do about Jenkins? Nothing. Nothing. Why the hell not? Because as soon as I heard her voice and listened to his half-crazy reasoning, I resigned as general counsel of the company. I'm not going to work with someone who behaves like that. Hearing that, I put down my glass and covered my face, trying to pull myself together. This was humiliating. Really humiliating. Was my temper really that strong? Nothing I had done so far had required any effort on my part. All I had to do was respond. I was well aware of my character flaws. As soon as I felt I had enough control over myself to not embarrass myself, I reached out and hugged him. Thanks, I said over his shoulder. Hey, you don't have to squint at me like that. It's not like I sold my stock or gave up my board seat. I'm a lawyer. Besides, I want to work more on my golf game. Would you like something to drink? I finally remembered what to offer. Next chapter. It was a meaningful conversation. It looked like Rylek had to be postponed, and the revenue stream they thought would be available never showed up. The programming department was on edge. Hector never got over the humiliation of me kicking him out of my office, and his sudden elevation had hurt people. They didn't work as efficiently. Besides, it looks like Carl quit too. Before he got Sheila, he was an animal, spending hours chopping code. Several corporate employees had traveled to Ohio to try to convince him to stay by offering him a serious pay raise. Does your friend have Tourette's syndrome and use swear words uncontrollably? Asked Harry. They had a general idea of his problems, even though they hadn't met him. No, just twitching and growling, I replied, embarrassed. Then it's not Tourette's syndrome, said Harry dryly. Poor Carl, said I, feeling guilty for dragging my friend into this. Poor Carl? Joel and Mark said that if it wasn't for his girlfriend, they wouldn't be sure they'd get out of there, and they refused to go back. And Gordon? I asked. He looked down at his Diet Coke. Gordon's is in a tough spot. His wife was a spender like yours, and he hasn't been as effective in curbing her. He's young, like you, and more emotional. I know for a fact that he didn't find out about them sleeping together until after things went south. He wrinkled his nose again. And he was picking sides, too. So Gordon and Andy are running the company? He nodded. And they're having financial and personnel problems. What? Several venture capitalists are asking pointed questions. If they could get out of their equity stakes, they would. Phil Turner is leading that group. Phil? Yes. I'm not sure he cares that Andy is having fun with a married woman. He really cares that Andy was willing to do it with one of his closest business associates. The fact that he also has a cute little wife is probably not coincidental. Let's just say that Andy's parties are much less likely to be attended by his business partners. If the men don't approve of this, their wives certainly do, and from what I understand, have some pretty strong opinions about it. In fact, Marge, says Harry's wife, fully supports my decision about the job. She wanted you to know that if you need anything, she'll be glad to help. Tell her thank you for me. What's the story with the staff? And several people have left the company because of all this. I'm not sure of their motives, because of the lack of revenue and the fact that several suppliers have quietly gone to our competitors. He threw me a questioning look, but I shook my head. All in all, things aren't looking too rosy, and they've let a few people go. That's terrible. Yes, but what are you going to do? They want to stop the bleeding. I'm not blaming you for that, but it's still happening. We promised to keep in touch, and he left, apologizing for a mess that wasn't really his fault. I sent Carl an email, thanking him for his support. He sent one back. Don't worry, I won't be working for them anymore. And I can't believe the horrible lies they are telling about you on the news. I'm working on fixing that. Carl. What the hell is he up to? I got a stomachache, and it wasn't just Carl. I started sleeping badly. You'd think with a billion lawsuits, divorce, betrayal, and bankruptcy, I'd sleep at all, but so far I'd managed to avoid most of them. There had been a few stressful nights when a little southern comfort was needed to take the edge off, but lately things had gotten worse, so much so that Prati had started showing herself again, and I'd been switched to decaf. These girls didn't miss a trick. Then one day, Prati turned to me. Mr. Reynolds? You're on YouTube, she said, as she looked up from my laptop where she was supposed to be working on her homework. I walked over and peered over her shoulder. Carl was on the screen. He was clearly stressing out a lot. He had pronounced ticks, and every third word looked like an yip, but he'd made a video in which he berated the press, Andrew, Allie, and told everyone what a prince I was for not only giving him his first job, but introducing him to his fiancée. His goddamn fiancée. My best friend in the world, who hated asking women for money when we were shoveling sidewalks, publicly putting himself out there and offering to give interviews to the media. Prati, why don't you go outside and play? Said I hoarsely. Mr. Reynolds, I haven't finished doing my homework yet. Pratty, she hissed. I was confused. Carl hadn't told me he was engaged, and here he was, quitting his job and getting media attention on my behalf. Me. The guy who left him alone during the reunion because I wanted to nail Rebecca Goldstein. The guy who often embarrassed him with Allie. The guy who used him to help build this company with free labor. And it wasn't just him. He'd lost his job. So had Gloria, a single mom with a baby. Mindy. George from security, who was supplementing his pension. A dozen people or more from our company, and from the sounds of it, the rest were on edge. They went into business with us, and as employers, we had obligations to them as well. Yes, I was not the prime mover, but my actions contributed more to their woes. Just because I victimized Andrew and Allie didn't give me the right to victimize other people. I remembered Judith's words to me a month or so ago. But if you choose a pit bull, be prepared to bleed. They're fighters. That's all they do. That's all they know how to do. I was so focused on winning and doing the most damage that I forgot that there are many innocent victims. Andrew, that bastard, was right, even if he only used it for manipulation. A lot of people were hurt by my actions. I had to change all that. Next chapter. My first action was to send another letter of intent to the company stating that I did not intend to seek a royalty refund for the next 18 months. I wasn't giving up my rights, but I didn't see how tying up their finances right now would benefit the people who would be most affected by my actions. We went to the stock market to raise money and spent a good $500,000 or more. The share price fell, and Andy was struggling to attract new investors. Businessmen seemed to value honesty and being married, neither of which allowed him to be trusted in any relationship. Those who weren't married got divorced, and Andy was a nightmare for the divorced. As for Allie, I sent her a personal letter informing her that I would agree to a 50-50th split if she unfroze our assets. I even offered to sign a document to that effect. Needless to say, suspicions were high, but I did my best to reassure her to the best of Thurman's ability. Finally, I got a list of names from HR and checked the company directory. And that Mindy helped me a lot when we were starting my new project. The first thing I did when they unfroze was write a check to Carl for the 2 years of work he did for me that he wasn't getting paid for. Yeah, he wasn't very good at the time, but I made it a solid lump sum and tried to add as much inflation as I could to get him as much money as possible. If anything, I wrote, he should take it as an early wedding present. I also advised him to seriously consider accepting their job offer. Carl is a proud man, which is why he was angry for so long. I guess Sheila was pragmatic and persuasive enough to get him to do the sensible thing, because I was glad my check cleared pretty quickly. Suddenly, sleep was no longer an issue. I sent out emails to everyone in the company who had been laid off and offered whatever I could to help them find new jobs. Needless to say, I got a lot of crap from a lot of angry former employees. Many of them wanted nothing to do with me. I made sure they had my email address and phone number and wished them luck. Others gladly accepted my help. I called every programmer, vendor, client, and personal friend to find them a job. In many cases, it wasn't enough. The economy in California was that bad. At this point, I decided to reassure myself and started paying some people to move. George wanted to go to Florida where his Social Security could provide enough to live on. Gloria wanted to be closer to her mother. I only used my half of the money. What were my motives? I had hurt a lot of people and I wanted to make things right. I couldn't control what people like Andy and Allie did to me, but I could control how I behaved afterward. Honestly, they were beneath me. They were already hurting, and I didn't want anything more to do with them. Next chapter. So I was very surprised when Allie called me. Hey, Jimmy! Jim? Hi, Allie. How are you? I'm fine. Thanks for asking. I was wondering if I could meet you. Maybe have a drink somewhere. Frank's? It was a bar we used to go to sometimes. Our lawyers won't like it if we talk together. Forget about our lawyers. This isn't about our divorce. This is about something else. When and where? She gave me the information I needed, and my schedule had been pretty loose lately. I said goodbye and put my phone in the holder. You can come in, I said as I opened the door. Mindy and Swati sheepishly walked into the room. I assume you all heard? I had long since given up trying to keep secrets from those two. They nodded. What do you think? Swati looked at Mindy, giving way to her. You should go. Mindy said, You need to finish. I'm not sure what this is about, but it can't hurt to listen. Swati nodded in agreement. But be careful, Mr. Reynolds. She's tricky. Always good advice. Next chapter. I got to Frank's and she was already sitting in the back booth, very well dressed. I moved across from her and ordered a drink. It was her show, and I figured she should be the host. You look good, she began. I've had a lot of free time, so I've been working out. As the saying goes, to get a man to go to the gym, you have to get a divorce. It works for you. She wrinkled her nose. I live in an apartment now. Oh? I waited. Yeah. Well, things didn't work out as well with Andy as I thought they would. I don't blame you for that. I blame the way we got started in the first place. You didn't help with those paparazzi stationed on our doorstep, but we brought it on ourselves. Sort of, I agreed serenely. I've heard what you do with former employees, and I want to help. Help? I puzzled. I doubt she knew any of our 10 employees. Yes, I want to donate some money and some time. Set up a phone bank, make some connections. You have to admit that I know a lot of people, and you're probably running low. But it was a brilliant idea. It has great optics. I can get People magazine to help us. Optics? I sighed. She sensed my sudden change in tone. Of course it's the right thing to do. But it's brilliant on your part, because not only will it help a lot of people, but it will rehabilitate your image. And the image of everyone else who worked with us and got hurt. I could see the wheels turning in her head. Allie, I said, trying to speak softly. Her shoulders slumped. You're not going to let me help you, are you? No, I won't let you. I'm not doing this because of the optics. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. I shrugged. Of course, one of the people I'm going to help get a job is me, so don't give me a halo. How did you find out about this in the first place? That secretary of yours is feeding information to the press. One of the reporters is a friend of mine, and he told me about your project. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. You're sleeping with her, aren't you? It was my turn to curve my lips in a slight smile. Remember the Bob and Tom show when we were in Ohio? She was puzzled by my sudden change of subject. Vaguely. They were funny to the point of weirdness. I know you liked it. I pick at the amusement again. Bob had a saying, show me a beautiful woman, and I'll show you a guy who's tired of entertaining her. She sighs. Excuse me? What do you mean? I mean that if you had asked me for a divorce before you started entertaining Andy, if you had been open and honest, we wouldn't be here today. I would have given you an honest divorce. Did you really think you were the only one who wasn't happy? But, you never made yourself known. Her ego was having a very hard time accepting that I had reason to be disgruntled. No. Because as you so piquantly put it, you chose who to love. But you forgot that you have to make that choice every day. Even if your wife is a snob. Even when she spends too much money. Even when she can be an annoying bitch. You're a hypocrite. You're doing the same thing. Treating that little secretary as a replacement. I shook my head again. No, I'm not. I'm not replacing her. Yes, I had my eye on her a few months ago, but at worst I was just eyeing her. thinking about how that new coat would look on me. I didn't expect you to steal my coat, so I needed another one. So we're not having fun. But that doesn't mean I don't see what could be next. So this is the end? For you and me? Yes. It's over except for the paperwork. She looked a little sad, a little angry, stood up and handed me the bill. But I didn't mind. The main thing was done. When all this started, I talked to Swati about how to handle the whole divorce thing. She said the following: Mr. Reynolds, these two are doing what they are doing by being hidden. You need to tell the world what they did so they can't do it again. So I couldn't let her soften her image. I also couldn't take her money. You see, part of my strategy in dealing with the insurers was to let them know they could pursue me all they wanted. My coffers were empty. They'd have better luck getting blood from a stone. A few small holders had already dropped their claims, and the rest, faced with a PR nightmare, fizzled out. Mindy asked the staff I was helping to talk to the press. They want to sue the man who is spending his fortune to save them? As Allie put it, terrible optics. How did I lose $3.5 million so quickly? Most of it went to unemployment, relocation, or retraining. I was in debt to my former coworkers. But Swati wanted citizenship. And there was still $1 million investor. Visa program. The potential immigrant doesn't even have to spend the money. You just have to invest it. He and Prati would become citizens very soon. And they needed an investment advisor. Do you know who that might be? Pradeep even agreed to forgive me for calling him a criminal. Carl, my best friend, got a huge check for his services. And in due course, I'll return part of that wedding gift for my own wedding. Or something like that. Or maybe I defragment his computer for $1 million. And let's just say Mindy isn't complaining about her compensation as my assistant. In fact, I let her pay most of the bills these days. She's not complaining, although we're still taking our time. Like I said, I'm no saint, even though I play one on television. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.